Well, sweet. We're going to talk about outside-in testing in Vue. There actually is a website. I mentioned to some folks a bit earlier. This is not going to be workshop format, it's just kind of presentation format. But if you want to follow along, you can check out this website, Learn TDD in Vue. It gives like the setup instructions for Cypress, the testing tool we're going to be using. But you can also check it out afterwards. It has a full, like we're recording this talk and it'll be up online, but that also has like article format of the instructions, so check it out there. So I'm coding it wrong. You'll find this out for yourself by experience in the next 45 minutes or so. We'll see what your opinion is of me. Yeah, like I said, talk to us about Vue projects. We'd love to hear from you. Another thing that Big Nerd Ranch has got going on, just this year we've kicked off the Frontier, a screencast website. Robbie was one of the big developers on that for a long time. So we've got web, iOS, and Android content up there. And for Meetup folks, we want to offer you a free 30-day trial because we want you to check it out. And we want you to give us feedback on what you'd like to see. We got some React stuff, some Vue stuff, some server-side stuff. And so we'd just love to offer that to you. So please check it out. Just the Frontier at bignerdranch.com. If you forget that, you can ask us afterwards, and we'd love to get you the hookup. So, yeah. So I've really enjoyed working in Vue last month. I enjoyed it looking into it. And for me, one of the biggest reasons is I feel like Vue is one of the most testable front-end frameworks. And there's one particular reason that I feel that way. Does anybody here use the Vue Webpack template created by Vue CLI? This is the one screenshot, probably only 100 pixels high, that is why, because unit tests and end-to-end tests are built into the Vue CLI templates that almost everybody uses. I found in the front-end worlds, I've been all through different kind of platforms. I spent most of my career on the server side. I've done some side projects in iOS, and I did about 8 months of iOS work here at Big Nerd Ranch. And then I've been in the front end for 1 month now. As I've looked at all of these, I was a Rails developer, and so I got the testing bug. Rails developers are all about testing. And so I've been looking for testing all these different places as I've gone around them. And what I found on the front end is there's a lot of talking about unit testing and component testing, but not so much talking about end-to-end testing and connecting it all together and walking through a user flow that might happen in your app. Hey, how's it going? Come on in. But Vue includes it out of the box, and it's one of the few front-end frameworks to do so. And so just the fact that it's even suggested, that it's even there in front of you to click through and explore and find out what it is a big, big plus. The tooling's already set up. You know, getting all the packages to work right can be a big pain, but it's working for you. Nightwatch is there out of the box. But that doesn't mean all your questions are answered. So you might recognize some of these questions if you've tried testing on the front end. Well, should I write the test code first or the production code first? Well, what parts of my app would I test first? How many end-to-end tests do I write, or unit tests? Is it a test pyramid? Is it the test hourglass, the test mushroom? There's lots of controversy around that in the JavaScript world these days. How much test code do I write at a time? A bunch of it? A tiny bit? How much production code do I write at a time? Sam and I were talking about that earlier today. Do I test every single line of code and configuration I do? Maybe that's less an issue on the front end, but in Rails we definitely talked about stuff like that. So there's a lot of things you have to make decisions about. Even though you have tooling out of the box, there's still a lot of things you need to make decisions about before you can get going in testing. And so I feel like test-driven development is actually sort of intended to be an answer to those questions. It's an approach to testing, not the only approach. You don't have to agree it's the best approach, but it's an approach to testing that provides a consistent set of answers to those questions. You could see, and I've seen myself in situations where the way I approach end-to-end tests and unit tests is kind of in conflict. And so I'm duplicating work, or maybe I'm leaving something out in between the two of those. And so I feel like when you take a test-driven development approach, you have like one set of answers to those questions. Just like Vue CLI gives you one set of tooling out of the box that works, in my opinion, test-driven development does the same for your process. If you haven't run across test-driven development before, here's a diagram from a book called Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. It's a long book name. But any approaches to TDD generally follow this cycle. You write a failing unit test, and then you make the test pass, and then you refactor. And some of that distinction gets around like, what's the simplest thing I can do to make the test to pass, and then afterwards I try to improve the code once I've gotten it working. And so you go through this. You write the test, you make it pass, refactor, and you kind of go on from there. Now we're going to be talking today about a certain kind of approach to test-driven development called outside-in testing. There's at least one, maybe two or three other approaches to it. But in outside-in testing, there's actually an outer loop around this inner loop. So this is a diagram from that Growing Object-Oriented Software book. I'm going to show the cover a bit later. I highly recommend it. It's the book that this approach to TDD really comes from. So in this diagram for this book, they show 2 levels of testing and 2 levels of loops. On the left there, they say write a failing acceptance test. For our purposes, that's the same thing as an end-to-end test. It's specifying what a user would do and the steps they would walk through. So then, when that acceptance test is failing, you step in to write a failing unit test. You make it pass and refactor, and you keep going through there and through that inner circle until the outer acceptance test is passing. So you have a bunch of small steps happening in the middle to help you accomplish the larger feature. And you write that larger feature test first, as opposed to building the individual pieces and then assembling them together. That's another approach, but in the outside-in testing approach, you start on the outside with an end-to-end test and then go down to the inside. It's all very abstract, so we're going to walk through an example of this in detail in a little bit. One thing first, though, I wanted to make a note about test coverage. So this is the output. This is also very remarkable. I've literally never seen this in any project I've been on, that code coverage metrics are included out of the box in Vue as well, in the Vue CLI Webpack template. So Istanbul is the name of the tool. Has anybody seen these running on their Vue Webpack project? So these come out and it'll show you how many of your statements, branches, functions, and lines are covered by tests.
Did you edit that to take a screenshot?
What do you mean?
To get the 100%.
No, this is the team I joined, actually, so they are rigid with it. But that actually comes down to the warning. I shouldn't say warning. You guys have more front-end experience than me. I've learned to not assume that my knowledge from one area of development applies to another. But I have some cautions in my own mind, and I'll share with you because I'm in front of a microphone. So the teams that I've been on, working on various platforms at Big Nerd Ranch over the last couple years, and also out in the testing community, the people I've learned from and really respect their views on testing, metrics on code coverage percent aren't really something that's come up in conversation. And I was wondering why for a long time, and I think, thinking about my Big Nerd projects in particular, what it was is this, and somebody can back me up if you can see this. As far as I could tell, these metrics in Istanbul come from unit test coverage, not end-to-end test coverage. That seems right in your experience too? Maybe? Yeah, being positive, I appreciate that. As far as I could tell, these numbers just come from your unit test coverage. Now our approach on the back end in Rails development is a bit different. When we're doing the outside-in testing, we sort of have, like by necessity, our end-to-end tests give us 100% coverage, in a manner of speaking, because we're writing those first. No features on the website we're putting together unless there's an end-to-end test that's driving us there. But at the unit level, it's different. So at the unit level, there's a bunch of small trivial things in Rails that we don't write unit tests for. Trivial functions and methods that are just returning a simple value, using like Rails's model data storage framework just out of the box with built-in stuff. We don't usually feel the need to test that. We usually find that those tests have a lot of cost over time that prevent you from refactoring, and not a ton of value as far as actually catching bugs or influencing your design or anything like that. And again, that's something else that we'll see as we come here, like when I do, in my approach to this particular problem we're going to do, when I do step down to a unit test or when I don't. So in that approach, you do have 100% test coverage in end-to-end tests, but not necessarily in unit tests. So that's just something to think about as far as you're thinking about these numbers. Come to a different view on it if you like. And that's one of the big things about learning testing, as all of us are on a trajectory going forward, is I've really found that as you hear different views, different principles, you put them into practice, you develop a taste and a sense for this test is feeling good, or this is feeling rigid, or this is feeling, I'm feeling a lack of confidence, like I don't have test coverage here. So even if you can't pinpoint it, it's time to reach back in the toolbox and try something else. It's a word of caution on test coverage metrics. So I want to talk about Cypress. Cypress is something I have a big shirt for, and there's a bunch of Cypress swag up here. So Cypress is actually the tool that we're going to be trying out today for testing purposes. It is, you guys in the back, there's a couple of Cypress team members in the back. There's Jennifer, and I'm so sorry, I'm terrible with names. Valerie. Jennifer and Valerie are here. Do you guys know off the top of your heads how long Cypress as a tool or company has been around?
3 years or so.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I started hearing about it around when I started here. It is really cool, and I think it's a great tool for test-driven development approach, and I'm going to show you why. So a few quotes from their website that I'm sharing here is, they said, one of our goals was to make test-driven development a reality for end-to-end testing. So a lot of other end-to-end testing tooling is based on Selenium. It's been around for a while. It was built before Dynamics, single-page apps, and really heavy front-end JavaScript. I haven't used it heavily enough on the front end to be able to have a very strong opinion, but even from back-end testing, like, there's some flakiness there. Like, there can be some challenges. And in my experience with Cypress, it takes sort of a gray box testing approach where Cypress runs your web app. It kind of knows more about what's going on in the browser than other approaches like Nightwatch and other Selenium-based approaches do. So it can lead to a really good quickness and increased reliability. And we'll see the turnaround time we're able to get here for our end-to-end test to run is really, really quick. So I can't say for sure, oh, I should say, the other quote says, Cypress unlocks the ability to do TDD with full end-to-end tests for the very first time. You will have developed more, your code will be better, and it will be completely tested. So I can't say for sure that it's impossible to do test-driven development with Nightwatch or other Selenium-based tools, but I really like Cypress a lot. So you can, that's what they say, that it's unlocked it for the first time, and it makes a lot of sense to me. So that's what we're going to be trying. You can also use Cypress for component tests as well. You might be used to using Mocha or Jest to do, and we'll see how that works and some of the benefits of kind of using the same testing API as you go through it. But yeah, so I recommend it. Cypress is nearing like a full 1.0 release. The tool itself is open source, so you just put it in as a dependency. But they're offering enterprise tooling to be able to run and offer all kinds of other features and things like that to get more insight into your applications. So check out their website. And we're going to get a chance to see it as we go here. So again, LearnTDD in Vue is the website you can go to if you want to follow along or check this out later, and I'll stick the link up at the end as well if you want to see. So now it's time for the live demo, always the smartest and most reliable thing to do in any presentation. So we're going to walk through really writing this out, but I do have a cheat sheet here, because I'm not so smart that I can remember it all off the top of my head. So the requirement is we're going to build the thing, and it's going to be a super simple, trivial thing, of course. So if there's anybody here that thinks testing is stupid, this will confirm your beliefs, because why would you need to write a test for this? But like many things like this tiny little thing we're building is standing in for larger problems and systems you would do. So we're going to do some kind of messaging system. It's going to do almost nothing in the course of our time together, but the requirement is, as a user, I want to be able to send a message, so typing a message into this system. It's intentional that I'm kind of phrasing this as a user story that you might have in Pivotal Tracker or Trello or whatever, because that kind of agile approach to thinking about things from a user standpoint matches up with an outside-in testing approach where you're starting with that user story. So let's jump into the code, and then after we walk through it together, we're going to have a little bit of talk at the end about like why TDD, what the benefits are that we've gotten from this approach, and things like that. All right, so we got to switch back over to here because I don't want to have a neck ache looking over here all the time. Where is that? There it is. All right. All right, so I've already got Cypress installed in the app. It's really simple. You add an npm dependency and start it up. Should I start? I'm going to write the test first. So Cypress creates a Cypress folder in your application. I should clarify, that Cypress is framework agnostic, so you can use Cypress with any front-end or server-rendered web application. But it is targeting JavaScript-centered apps that can have some extra knowledge of them. And when we get to the component testing, a guy named Gleb, who's works for Cypress, has created tools to hook into Vue components, React components, frameworks I've never even heard of components. It's really great. And so that's what allows us to do, kind of get into the internals and render components. So you can try out Cypress with whatever framework you might be using at work right now. So we're going to create an integration test. We're going to say creating a message spec. And Cypress, you guys please correct me if I get anything wrong in the facts here, but I believe Cypress is using not under the hood, but like in the test you're writing, it's not reinventing the wheel. And so it's using Mocha, Chai, and Sign-On, tools you may already be familiar with for writing the test. It's the runner and some of the logic that it runs in that's unique to Cypress. So in here, we're creating a message, so we're just going to start with the usual describe. Creating a message. Is that font size okay-ish? I can increase it if necessary. Cool. So let's say, okay, so when we create this message, we're going to say it displays the message in the list. Okay, so now we're going to start taking advantage and using the Cypress API. You don't need to do requires or imports with its objects because they kind of is set up assuming that your tests will need these things. So there's just a sci object that you can variable you reference to call methods on. So we say when I visit a URL. This is something you'd be typical for end-to-end testing frameworks. So it does actually hit the running application running in another port. I'm sure there's other ways to set it up, but for our purposes here, we're just going to hit the running application at the normal port we do. So the first thing we want to do, so we're thinking about the application for the outside. What steps does a user want to go through? And so let's say, okay, so we're going to want to type in this message we want to send. So we want to get an element on the page. We use just a regular DOM selector, and I'm going to use, you may have run across this data test approach to selecting elements. You can select them, this is just a regular selector, so you could select by class or by ID. I'm going to use data test, and it can be really nice to prevent your test code from being coupled to other aspects of your app that might change. So we're going to say get message text. So once we get this message test element, so this is going to be an input, we're going to just type. So we just say type, new message, and then that's typed in. So now we're going to say we need to click a button. So we're going to say data test equals save button. Just want to click, so we're going to click. And so now we're going to start, we've done the actions, and we want to do some assertions. So we're going to say check something on the page. We need to find, we're going to expect this message to be somewhere on the page. So we're going to look for something that has the message text. We're just going to pick a name for it. Let's get those quotation marks right. And we're going to say that the message text should have value empty string. This is a little bit atypical, like have value in a string there. I found I needed to do this to get it to correctly detect like the fact that there's no text in there at all. Oh yeah, I've explained this wrong. No, this is the same message text input that we used earlier. So I'm testing here that it gets cleared out. Because when you're in your messaging app, you type a message, you hit send, it gets cleared out and it's ready for you to type in the next message. But yeah, to get this, to make sure that it actually, I think when I was doing a different testing approach, it was like checking that it contains somewhere. So like, yes, every string contains empty string. So I think I needed to use should have value in order to make sure it exactly matched the empty string. There's plenty of API docs for Cypress you can read through. And of course, they reference Mocha and Chai and Sign On to get more details.
And you have to test your initial state first. So you return it empty.
That's a good point. Sometimes I do that approach, other times I don't. I would definitely add that in if I found that there was a problem. Like if things blew up because there was a pre-existing thing that got put in there. So that's a good question. But yeah, I don't know for sure if it started out with an empty string. And then the other thing we're checking, and so this is a testing philosophy. So these other items we've looked for by specific data test selectors, and now we need the message to show up somewhere on the page. But I haven't, I know these need to be a message text input and a save button. I don't really care, at this point, I'm not designing a specific DOM hierarchy of where it shows up. In general, in my end-to-end tests, I like to be just really loosely coupled and kind of at the level of abstraction that a user's thinking about. And so really, I just want to say that the page contains the text new message somewhere on the page. You could test for a specific element if you had chat history if you wanted to, but in my case, I just want to say somewhere on the page. So that's what I decided. You can code along if you want to try something else. That's great. So I think that's it for the test. I have started up Cypress already. So Cypress actually runs as an app. It comes up here. And now that I've added a test, this test runner window comes up. It's got a little progress going. Cool. And creating a message spec with a super small font on this screen shows up there. But when I click on it, it's going to actually open it up in a new instance of Chrome. So the test comes up. I did increase this font size, so this should be readable, hopefully. I'm just going to take just a moment to load it up. There we go. And so you can see on the left-hand side, we get this series of steps and some indicators. We get a real address bar in Chrome up here, and then a faux address bar here, showing what Cypress is navigating to. And again, so this is the fact that Cypress has knowledge of what's going on. It's not a tool outside of your browser that's sending messages into your browser and then waiting 5,000 milliseconds to trying something else again. It can tell when things are running. So Cypress kicks it up and runs it off. And so looking at the steps right here, we get some nice, very clear error messages. So it's attempting to visit the URL, and it does. It's attempting to get the message text, and then it says, expected to find element, but but never found it. So that's nice and straightforward. So the test is, we've gotten a red test, and so now it's time to implement some code to get past this test. In a test-driven development approach, you really want to focus on each failure or error you're getting and just write just enough code to get past this error. And so right now we just want to get something with data test message text onto the page so we get past this error. So to do that, let's go back and write some Vue. So I have an app here. I've just cleared out with everything. So here's a next step where something is a bit different about the outside-in testing approach. And you could be doing like a kind of outside-in testing, just slapping on an input right into this element and being good to go. But in the approach described in that Growing Object-Oriented Software book, there's a principle they use called write the code you wish you had. And what this does is it helps you get a little more quickly to the kind of components that you want to break the app up into. And so as I'm looking here, I don't just say, well, what can I put in there that I already have in my toolbox right now? So what do I wish I could write here in the app, the very root of my application? Well, I probably don't want an input text field right here because this is the root of my app. I'm probably ultimately going to have navigation bars and footers and place to throw modals and things like that. So that's an input right here is just way too much detail. So really what I'd like to have is a component. And maybe I'll shuffle things around before, but for right now I can say, well, at the top we're going to have a text field and a button. Maybe it's a new message form. So let's call it new message form. I wish I had a new message form component, so we're just going to write it and act like we wish we had it. So to get that to work in Vue, of course, we're going to need to do a few steps. We're going to need to import it from a file. Put it in here. And of course, this does not exist yet. So you could say, okay, maybe I'm going to rerun my test now if you want to take very, very, very small test-driven development steps. But like we know this is not going to work. We know it's not there. So I think we can go ahead and make the step of creating the component. So we're going to make it here, new message form. I forget if my IDE has autocomplete. Yeah, there we go. Good old Visual Studio Code. Cool. So I'm just going to make the simplest possible component. And again, we're not trying to solve the whole feature right now. All we're trying to do is get past that one failure. So what I'm going to do is create a div in here. And again, this is not going to solve the problem, but I've typed a little bit of code. I wouldn't do this in a real project, but I'm going to rerun the test right now just to do small steps. So we can go back in here into Cypress. We've got the run button, rerun it. The app is coming up, so no errors have happened or anything like that. But again, of course, we still have no input on the page. But now we're ready. Like we've written the code we wish we have, and now we have a place where we can just drop it in. So we're going to go input. I'm going to go ahead and put this on multiple lines because I know we're going to want them. Now we just do that data test element. The selector to choose the element. All right, so this should now actually pass that error we're getting and get us to the next step. So we rerun.
It's test, not text.
Text.
In the test files. Yeah.
The test file too.
Yeah, you said test and text.
See, this is why pair programming is so useful. You guys are just saving me so much time. This is great. All right, cool. So we pass it. And actually, you'll see, as you might have imagined from the fact that there's a giant white rectangle over here, that it's actually showing the page. And so that's really great. Some test tools do, some test tools don't. It's really useful. So we can see that there's a text field there, message test, not text, the message test text. And we can see that the value is being filled in just fine. And now, of course, we get the error we would expect. The save button we asked about is not showing up. And so that's very easy, and we're just ready to implement that directly now. We can drop that right into here. Save button is probably not going to have any words that are going to give me trouble, so that's good. Testing. Yeah, it's just the pride comes before the fall, so it's just be ready for the next amusing thing. Cool, so that's ready. And the speed of this, by the way, this is not a marketing pitch. Like Cypress does not pay me any money. They gave me this shirt before they offered them to you guys. But other than that, well, please, they're shirts. Please come take one. It's fast. Like the project we're on to start up the end-to-end suite, it's like 45 seconds. So that's not that. You're going to run that before you check in your code, maybe. But you can run Cypress TDD like this for these quick feedback loops. All right, so the save button shows up. Of course, it's accepted. And now we're on to the assertions. So we're checking that the input would have the empty string value, but the value was new message. So it has not been cleared out. So now we're finally at the point where we're going to implement some behavior. We've added some elements. Now we're adding some behavior. So at this point, for something this simple, like you could just go ahead and implement that yourself. But this is the point on that outside-in testing approach where you would step down to a unit test level. And in this case, I'm going to consider these component tests to be unit tests, these lower-level tests where you're interacting with a piece of code the way the rest of your code interacts with it, as opposed to the end-to-end user. So this behavior, having this action run and clear out the input, like I want to test that on this component. And one of the reasons, there's many, many reasons that stepping down to a lower level like this can be valuable. As fast as these tests are, if you test all the combination of possible scenarios in your app and end-to-end tests, like it's still going to add up over time. And so at a component level, you can test all the possible edge cases in a focused way. It can also help with your design to build out components that are easy to use and reuse. So that's where we're going to step down now, and we're going to write a unit test. So to do that, we're going to create another spec in this folder. And so this one is no longer for this user flow, it's just for the new message form. If the camel case plus underscore bugs you, I apologize, but that's what I wrote. I don't think Cypress cares, so I think in other runs I've done .spec.js. So do what you love. Cool, so now what we're gonna do, we want at the unit test level, we wanna reproduce the same error that's happening at the end-to-end test level. And that's gonna help us to drive out the behavior at the unit level that will then satisfy the end-to-end test. So we do need to do a few imports here. We have this mount view from Cypress view unit test. So this is the utility function that is view specific that's gonna help us to be able to work with a component directly in here. And then we wanna import message form. We're gonna import our component from new message form. Cool. So again, it's interesting that the end-to-end tests are view agnostic, so they don't know anything about view, but the component test does, and it's actually importing our code. So that's just a kind of interesting difference between how they work. All right, so we want to describe, this is done with Mocha as well, describe a new message form. And so at this point, we're talking about what the behavior of this component is. And so we can say, so we're going to talk about the situation where you click, when you're clicking the save button. I'm going to go ahead and put this into describe with a separate it in it, because I know in advance there's two different behaviors we're going to drive out here. But so we'll have to wait and see what that is. So we're going to say it clears the text field. So that's the thing that's not happening that we need to build out. And so I'm remembering the first thing we need to do, there's just a simple before each we run at the top here to run mount view, and we just pass it. The simplest form, when you just have a component you don't need to pass any props to or anything like that, you can just pass the component directly into mount view and you're good to go. And then it'll expose it through an API. So we say here, so this is interesting. This is really, I guess what I said a minute ago maybe isn't the most accurate when I said you're not interacting at this unit level like an end user, because in these component tests you actually are, like it's actually literally the same Cypress commands. And so I'm going to copy those over. You're not visiting a page because that component is mounted, but we are going to type in there, click the save button. And so I have, and actually, the assertion is even the same. So at this point, especially if you're, wary of test-driven development, and you're like, what? You were writing the same test twice. Like, what are you doing? The second test case we're going to do is going to be a little bit different. I actually wrote a blog post on this recently about 3 different ways to test components in Vue. So using just the built-in Vue functionality that's currently described in the Vue.js guides, using Vue test utils, the library that's kind of built on top of that, and then using Cypress. And what I found was, even though you could say, oh, well, you're using the API of the component when you're just interacting directly, but that's not the way you interact with it in the rest of your app. Like, you're not calling $mount on components in your day-to-day Vue development. You're just plugging them in. Vue is handling that for you. And so I think you'll see as it comes together that interacting with the individual component in the way a user does like this, that is useful. And then as we see props coming in or events coming out, you'll see that we do code those in here. Ed Yerberg, the creator of Vue test utils, calls this the contract of the component. And so if you're looking at the Vue docs for component testing, you might see things like calling methods on the component individually, checking the values in the data of the component. And we're doing that on the project that I'm on right now in Vue. The way that I kind of prefer is testing to the contract of the component, as Ed describes, where you're thinking about the outputs and the inputs. Inputs might be the props passed into it. It might be data in a Vuex store that the component pulls in. And it could be user inputs like this. And then outputs could be DOM changes on the screen. They could be events emitted, or they could be actions executed. Is that the right word in Vuex? I'm still new to this. It's actions, right? All right, cool. I can admit that. Yeah, so that's the inputs and outputs of the component. And so I found the most value testing at the component level that way, as opposed to calling individual Vue internal methods yourself that you don't call in day-to-day work. So we'll see. You can remain skeptical. That's totally fine. So we'll see. So this test is very much the same. We're interacting with these inputs and then checking the input that exists on the component itself independent of the rest of the application. So if we save this, pop back over into Cypress, we can see in the Cypress screen now this extra test is showing up. So when we click on that, it's going to reopen. Yeah. And then just in the same interface, and this is really unique when I think about it, even a component test will actually show up on the screen, and so you can see visually what's happening with the component. These component tests are extremely fast though, and so like you do get a very, very quick turnaround. So I haven't experienced any pain compared to like lower level test runners. But so we can see very similar steps. If the UI is just the same, the component shows up just the same. We enter the text, we click the save button because we have built those pieces out already. And now we have reproduced the error. We've expected the input to have the empty string, but the value was new message instead. So now we've got the unit test, the component test, specifying the behavior we want. So now we can go ahead and implement it. So jump in.
Are you running the same both tests or just the?
At this point, I'm just running the one test. That's a great question. There is a run all test button that you can run to run the whole suite, and so we can rerun that at the end. If we run it, we can click it now, and we'll see that both of them would show that they're failing, and they will all be passing at the end. So this is a nice thing just about the fact that often in an outside-in test, because of the virtue of that nested cycle, you will have a failing acceptance test while you're going red and green at the unit testing level. So that's one of the nice things about being able to run individual tests so easily in Cypress, is that it keeps you focused on the unit level, and you can ignore that failing acceptance test until it's time to jump back out to the outer loop. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, this is showing both of those failures. All right. So we'll go in here. I'm going to zoom this over for reasons that will become apparent momentarily. All right, so in our component, we're going to code this out. So we want to save the input here with vmodel. Input text is what we can call it. We want to set up that data on the component. Oh, I guess let's go ahead and type this in for debugging purposes. I don't need that. We could be stricter with TDD and not type it in. Let's wait until the test forces us to. But we do need the data. And so we're going to return our object, and we want input text on here. We want it to start as an empty string. Cool. So this should now be saving the input text, and this would not make any changes to the test to make it pass. But what we can do is add an action. Equals save. When we click on the save button, save, and then here. And so this is interesting. If you haven't done TDD before, this will feel weird. Because what I'm going to do when the user trusts me to save the data is to immediately throw it away. So that's what we're doing, because that's what the test told us to do. Goodbye input, we don't care about that. But this should get us past the currently failing test, the current test failure. So let's save it. And actually for component tests, usually this is rerun itself automatically. Something has gotten out of sync. Let me try that again, maybe because it's failing. Let me try that. Something got out of sync, but usually when you're doing a component test, it will automatically update. And that's really cool. I have no idea how Cypress does that. But because it knows about, and it relates to the fact that Cypress knows about Vue here. At the end, I was wondering, at first I was like, oh, why doesn't the end-to-end just do that? I'm entitled, like my free software, I should do everything I want. The end-to-end test doesn't know about our Vue application, so it doesn't necessarily know all the pieces that are being run. But this component test does know about that component. And so some kind of magic it's using is to detect changes in that file and rerunning. So you can actually keep that up there and see as you go when things fail or when things succeed. It's gotten out of sync again. Okay, well, there it goes. Fails. One thing you notice, when it is failing, it was waiting about 4 seconds. So Cypress knows when asynchronous things like animations and AJAX requests are happening. And so once things are settled, it'll wait for about 4 or 5 seconds. I'm sure it's configurable, but that's the default amount of time, just to see if something needs a little bit of time to pop up. But unlike wait statements in Selenium-based approaches, as soon as that value's there, it's done. And so you can see here, it's not waiting 4 or 5 seconds to pass the test. It's good to go. So that's some of the speed gain you can get from Cypress. Cool, so we've got the input clearing out, so that's great. And so now we should be able to pop back up to the acceptance test level. Again, because we're so focused on just one test failure at a time, we're just not thinking ahead. We're letting the test guide us there. And so now we see that this assertion that the input has the empty string has passed, and that's great. And so now we're almost all done. Almost the entirety of our acceptance test is passing. And we just have this assertion here that the page contains new message somewhere is passing, and that's errored out. So this piece is a little bit different. This is what's going to actually break us out of building one component to build an actual feature in an application. And so this one, this takes a few different steps. So we can think about how we want to do this. The way I'd like to do this is to have a separate component. Like when I thought of the new message form, it's like, okay, well, this will have the text field and the button. And then like the message list will be like a separate thing. So that feels like a component. And so I'd like to write that code that I wish I had. But actually, I would like to not write that code yet. There's probably different orders you can do it, and I'm sure the authors of the book would have a very academic way that they would understand exactly how to do this. But for me, I'm thinking about, well, what do I need to do to get this message that I've created in new message form and get it out of that into this message list form that I want to create? And so the first thing that I need to do is to get the data back into the app component. I'm not going to do Vuex yet. We're just going to keep it in the component. It's fine. So this is a new behavior on the component that I want to do. I want to call emit an event to pass that data back up. And so we can specify that in the component test. And so this is the one that's going to feel a bit more like a programmatic unit level test, because we're going to specify that that event is emitted. So what we can do is, like, we're actually going to extract some of these setup tests here, the setup steps here, to another before each. So anytime for now or any future things we're doing with clicking the save button, we want these steps to be run. So we'll move those up into the before each. And we say, okay, clicking the save button, we want it to clear the text field, and we want it to emit a save event with the message. And so this is something to notice. You may have heard about this approach in different testing circles, the idea of have one assertion per test. And sometimes it's like, well, maybe you're not just checking one thing, maybe you're checking a few different things. But the idea of that we need to clear the text field and the idea that we need to emit a save event, those are two very different things. And so those feel like two things to assert. We can share our setup code, but we can assert something about the text field and something about the event separately. And Cypress, like many test runners, is going to show those for us very clearly. And so by having those small individual assertions, it'll give us nice, quick feedback on if something breaks in the future. So we just share the setup, and then down here we check that a save event was emitted. Another thing we can do in the before each is use sign-on. We want to create a spy. Actually, we need a variable. See, this is why I can't think about this stuff in the moment. So I need a spy variable here. Who here has used sign-on for test doubling before? It's less common to reach for it, but well, this is a great example. Like, I wasn't totally sure in a JavaScript world what it commonly comes up for. This is a great example of it. So for this spy, we can say, we're actually not accessing sign-on directly. We just say cy.spy. So we get this spy object. This is an object. It's a function that's going to let us check to see if calls were made against it or what was passed to it. So for the spy, we're going to say, okay, in Cypress.view, this is an object that's exposed by this Cypress view unit test thing. We can say on. So we want to look for different events that occur, that are emitted. We say on the save event, we're going to call spy, which again is an object that's going to record that a call was made on it. So we don't have any broader component that's instantiating new message form and telling it to watch for certain events to happen. We're just setting up the broader view container that the Cypress unit test is running in and saying record when a spy event is emitted. So now down here we want to check this. We say, okay, I expect that the spy, to clarify it, the name, let's change the name real quick. Let's call this save handler. Because that's effectively what it represents in your actual application. You'd have a save handler that would be called. So we say, expect save handler to have been called with new message. So we're confirming that it was called and confirming that new message is in fact passed to it. So we're going to save. Oh, are we still at the, oh yeah, we're at the acceptance test level. So let's pop back down to the unit test. Cool. So you can see that clears the text field test is passing, but the emit to save event test is not. Makes sense. We're doing TDD. So expected the spy to have been called with arguments new message, but it was never called. That's exactly what we would expect. So now it's time to implement this behavior. So we're going to implement the event emitting here in the normal way. It's just nice and concise. In our save method here, we want to say this.emit, save, and we're going to pass input text. So now we're hanging on to and being trustworthy with that input the user's given us. And now when we hit this, it's going to rerun automatically and it passes. So again, the component is just living standalone. You're just emitting an event like you usually would. But it's now the Cypress view unit test that's intercepting that and giving us a spy that we can check that it was called. So at the unit level, that is now passing. We can pop back up to the acceptance level. It should not be passing because, like I said, there's a few different pieces of wiring we need to put together here to get this feature working. But now we've got an event successfully emitted from our form, and now we can wire into that. And so this, I should say first, going back to the unit test and when to step down and when not to, you'll notice that when we were building out the form, we built out the input and we built out the button before we stepped down to the unit test level. And our unit test doesn't say, I expect there to be an input, I expect there to be a button. And that's because I've really found that for these unit tests, these component tests, testing behavior is really the right thing to do. The acceptance test sufficiently covers whether there's the form fields for you to fill in, so that's all good to go. It's really when you want some functionality, some logic or behavior in your component, that's when I find the most value to a unit test. And actually, Ed Yerberg's talk from ViewConf was very, very useful to me. I think it actually might have been from View Amsterdam, one where he gave, I assume he probably spoke at ViewConf here as well, maybe. But it was one talking about a great overview of different types of testing, including snapshot tests, which will record the visual output, not the visual, but the DOM output of your component, and it'll compare that for changes. And so a snapshot test is something that's better to reach for like making sure that the DOM stays the same once you've got like the look and feel of your component working the way you want to. So a unit test like this is more useful in my mind for logic and functionality. So that's when I do step down to the lower level and when I don't. Okay, so we've got our acceptance test. We still have not rendered this new message out to the page. So let's think about what to do. We now have the new message form. It's emitting a save event. And so now we can say, okay, we're going to catch that. That's not the right word. When a save event occurs, we're going to add the message. So time to write that out. And again, you could rerun the test here and see that the error comes up that I guess it either explicitly says, hey, there's no add message, or maybe it just silently fails. But one way or the other, we're just going to go ahead and code it. So add message. We're going to take the text in. And so what do we want to do? I think we need some data array to put it into. So we're going to return, let's just call it messages. Again, this would work. This approach definitely works working with Vuex as well, and we've been working on that on the project that we're doing. And one of the nice things about end-to-end tests is it lets you refactor to different data storage approaches. If you have some components where you start with just storing the data directly in them and then you move over to Vuex testing, unit level tests might not cover that, but an end-to-end test level will because you're just showing that the same behavior occurs for the user. So we got our messages there, and we say this messages. I'm going to do unshift, very computer sciencey term, to stick this text on the front, because even though our test is only going to create one message, I'm thinking ahead. I want to unshift it onto the front, not push it onto the end. So we got that. And so again, this is now stored in there, but again, nothing's going to show up on our page any differently. But now, hopefully, if I've done it right, and our test will ultimately tell us, we've got those messages there. So I think I'm going to go back to writing the code I wish I had. I wish I had a message list, and we'll pass the messages to it. And so let's go ahead and get that going. Import message list. All right, I can put this back. I don't need to show that side there anymore. Add our component. Because I'm presenting and you've seen that I missed details, let's just go ahead and rerun the acceptance test to make sure nothing's blown up. Okay, app's still loading up just fine. It's good to go. Cool. So now we're ready to start implementing the behavior in the message list. And again, at this point, because all this is just a simple functional component. Like it's taking data passed into it and it's rendering it out to the screen. And so because of that, like I don't feel the need to step down to a unit test at this point. Maybe, I don't know, maybe if it was a really complicated visual component, maybe I would. But at this point, I don't feel like I need that guidance. I feel like the end-to-end test is going to cover it. So we're just going to render it out. Let's just do a list. I could have dropped in like a CSS framework or something to make this look okay, but I'm a backend guy. I like data. I don't want to CSS anything. So we're just going to look. It should be the ugliest possible thing to TDD. But there's totally a valid reason for that, which is because when you have end-to-end tests, you can restyle things, and the tests cover it. So that is the very valid reason why I'm not doing any styling on this. That's definitely what I was thinking.
Question more on this topic.
Yes.
Does Cypress do visual regression testing?
No, it's on our roadmap.
Cool. Email me when that happens.
Have you worked with that in any other frameworks or environments? I've heard about it, but I've never played with
I
it.
hate visual regression testing because we get to have a whole separate thing set up to do it. So, and you're already rendering the whole page, so I imagine that it's something possible. It's just hard to do properly.
Yeah, we're working on our screenshots and all of that behind the scenes right now. So yeah.
All right, so let's render this out. V4, message and messages. Gotta have that key. Actually,
Isn't it before?
this is great. Probably want props too, right? I'm used to Ember, man. I don't have to declare any props or anything. I'm definitely not typing in any types here for my props. That's for sure. So. And if you think if that bugs you, when I did a React Native presentation recently, I didn't have linting turned on, and like there was semicolons, there was lacks of semicolons. It was making people go crazy. So I got linting turned on now, so we can all be sane. Yes. Oh, we could have some religious wars about linting versus prettier after this. That could be fun. Cool. So we're rerunning, and sure enough, the test is passed. So stuff is appearing and disappearing as I'm hovering over it. I think I'm discovering things about Cypress as we go. It looks like it's actually taking you through time as you're hovering over stuff. It's showing you the state of things. Ta-da.
Question: if you take the cursor out and jump in, does it rerun it from the top, or?
I don't think it's rerunning it here. It's looking like it's got access to the. Why don't you fill us in?
It's just showing me as if it read off of you when that command was executed. Yeah, so they literally capture the whole DOM on each step and then remake it.
The
future is here. The past, I guess the past is here.
I forgot to talk about my stuff. Like, you guys should just come up here. Let's just click around and we'll all figure out Cypress together. This would be great. You never know what's hiding in there. Yeah, DOM snapshot pin. Cool. All right. Well, great. Well, cool. Well, our end-to-end test is passing. And so let's go back. Like, we haven't touched any components, but let's just see the whole suite running. So it kicks it up. We got our end-to-end test and our component test both running together.
Running at the same time?
One after the other. I think it looks like it was sequential.
No, you're right.
As part of one run.
Yeah.
When do you start hitting memory ceiling running whole tests?
Yeah, so you have to set a limit.
Okay.
We only capture so many tests, and you can change that. So yeah.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Do you do like a running then the most recent tests at that limit, or just the first
Yeah, it
one?
starts cleaning up the older ones. So like if you ran 100, you only see like the DOM snapshots for the last 20 or something like that.
Nice.
Gotcha.
Bad boy, right?
There you go.
That's enterprise.
Yes.
Get all 100 of those.
Nice. Cool. So we've test driven it. We got our. To go back to the presentation. Let's take a look at that. Let's go back to that outside in loop. So yeah, we got that acceptance test, that end-to-end test. We wrote it out from the start. That whole time I was working on one user feature. We thought about the steps the user would go through before we started implementing any of them. We implemented some simple things at the acceptance test level, but once it got to behavior of units especially ones that we might want to reuse other places, we said, okay, we want to test this in isolation. We want to get this thing to have a nice simple contract. Like we want to think through, well, is it emitting an event, or should we go ahead and store it to Vuex, or what? And so like working at the unit level gave us a chance to think through those kind of design decisions to create a component that had the inputs and the outputs, the contract that we want to work with. Once we finished going through that loop a few times, we looped back up to the acceptance level. We had some more work to do at the acceptance level, and then we were done. So let's go back to here to talk about why TDD. Again, if you weren't a fan of TDD, this probably didn't convince you because like I could have written that in 5 seconds or whatever. But let's talk about scaling this approach way up to the applications that you work on in Vue or in something else. What advantages can you think of to taking an outside-in test-driven development approach to this? What benefits do you get from TDD?
Stop some feature creep.
Can you tell me more about that?
So when you're doing it, from that outside in, when you're saying, here's, what I actually need to deliver to the user from the user perspective, instead of sitting there going and writing a bunch of individual unit tests, because, I want to do this and this and this and all these things that aren't specified, that aren't required, that the user's not going to notice or need, I make that test pass, right? I do the littlest steps I can to get that outside test to pass, and then move on, right? Maybe it's a new requirement that we need, maybe I push that up to the product team, but I stop just packing more things in because my test is already passing.
Yeah, that's been a big help to me on the project that I'm on, I think because it was a big system before I joined, and so I had a lot of uncertainty about like, what are all these pieces and what do I do? And so being able to just start with I just need a new component that displays this one thing. Okay, I can build that. Okay, and okay, now I'm gonna add another thing, and now I'm gonna add a behavior, and you can work one little bit at a time. So for me, it was just, like not having to think about the big picture, not having to learn the whole bits of the existing system at once. Other benefits of TDD you can think of.
You got a large system and you want to refactor, you want to have confidence that it's going after the refactor, you haven't broken a lot of things.
Yeah, definitely. That makes me think, some people criticize like a unit testing approach because they say, well, it hinders refactoring. Like you've specified exactly what this small thing does. And in a sense it does. If you're replacing those things, then it's like that can hinder refactoring. But that's why having the two different levels helps. Like the acceptance test level allows you to remove components and recreate them in different ways, or entire screens or combinations of components. But I just as often run into situations where the internals of a component have to get refactored because I'm adding new possibilities, new alternative paths, and so having the protection there, it enables you to do both kinds of refactoring.
Most would hurt me when you said, well, I want it, I'm going to do it the way that I imagined it or desired to be. It's like, no, you write it the simplest way, and then you go back and refactor it.
Yeah, and I, talking about outside-in testing with some friends of mine from Greater Sum who are really into, around here, right? Yeah, them, are really into classical TDD. That the same thing bugged them. They're like, what? No, right? Because I didn't show any refactoring, and so I haven't read back through the book yet. Like that didn't occur to me. I want to read back through the book and see what they say about that, because it's not the same. So the other approach you could take is, hey, well, the simplest thing is to put those objects directly on, the DOM elements directly on the app, and then refactor at this point in the app, and then the refactoring step would be, now let me extract this into a component.
Yeah. And then that's really easy, right? Because you've already got tests running, and you know it's going to pass, and when it breaks, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
here it is. It's fewer pointers. You forget fewer things. You don't have to remember as much.
Right. In fact, I didn't plant you in the audience.
My side of the religious war.
Yeah. Well, I didn't plant you in the audience or anything, but I actually have a screencast on the Frontier that's about that. It's about extracting a component. I think that one's done in React, but it's with Cypress. The principles are exactly the same for Vue, where you have an end-to-end test that's covering something. You want to extract that logic, and so you write a unit test and unit test the extraction of it. Like, okay, I unit test the building out of the thing, and then you just substitute it in, and the end-to-end test still passes and confirms that things are working. So, yeah, sign up for that 30-day account. Check it out.
And then people who say that the unit test breaks, let's just say refactor the unit test. That's
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that you did that helps protect against refactoring causing a problem is using those data attributes. So what I ran into immediately when I tried to do this was I'm like, okay, let me check if this list element is on the page. And then later I decide I don't want a list, I want a card or something like that.
Yeah.
So you refactor and you break it because you're detecting something specific in the DOM. But if you know that the element doesn't matter, but the just that something be there with that content,
Yeah.
then you can protect yourself from those kind of easy breaks by having that data test equals whatever.
Right.
To just find it.
That's like another principle of better testing, and it's a great example of like what you did when you chose to test the behavior versus the implementation. So testing implementation details is what makes it difficult when you refactor versus testing behavioral stuff. Doesn't matter how it's implemented.
So what would you say to, like, that makes good sense on the unit test, but on the end-to-end test or on a larger test, I would expect that I would bind that to the UI component so that if I change it, it does break, right? Like, that's the time when I would expect the break to occur.
Yeah.
So, and you just copy, which also hurt me, because then you're just repeating yourself, but.
So you have the discretion to decide.
Yeah,
when
absolutely,
you
you can
do not
choose,
test.
right, so.
Yeah.
I think tests don't need to be dry the same way that your code should be dry. You ever heard of damp?
Yeah, nice,
I'm
nice.
I'm not joking.
Yes.
That's the thing. It's descriptive and meaningful phrases. Tests seem to be very simple. This is the same reason that I do TDD instead of test later. So I'm writing a test because when I write code, I'm going to screw it up, right? I mean, maybe you guys all just write code and it comes out fine, but that's not true for me, right? When I'm writing code, I regularly make assumptions that don't matter either. Well, when I'm writing tests, I'm writing code. And so I regularly write tests that also don't quite do what I think they're doing at first. And if I write the test, I've done this in fact, I've written a test passes, code was already done, everything's good, I'm out, right? I just went green and good. Turned out later that test was testing nothing, it wasn't accomplishing anything at all. And so I need to see the test go.
Well, that's why I say, aren't you testing the initial state? Because I've written a test or two myself where it's like, oh yeah, this one passes, and it's like, yeah, he was always going to pass. So
Yeah.
you need to write the test so it fails first.
That's true. One thought I was going to give on the data test attributes, I remembered a phrase I heard recently was, like there's different purposes for pulling up things in the DOM. So styling is one thing, where it's like, I want to style these things in a certain way. And so when it's like the idea of single responsibility, isolating things that change for different reasons. So, styling is one reason things might change. And so having, maybe IDs, but likely classes for things to be styled. So those would change. You might have other elements that, your application, your production JavaScript code, I guess, especially if you're not using Vue, but maybe hitting elements directly, maybe you're looking for IDs, or maybe it's other classes as well on things, or maybe it's other kind of data elements. So by using data test attributes, you're now isolating the test responsibility and reason to change from production JavaScript code and from styling. And so that just, the idea is like, things could still break, but like even if the way the production code works and the way the designer wants things to look totally change, there's no reason to change a data test attribute other than if something related to your testing changes. So that's, I've used IDs to look stuff up in the past or classes, but that's one of the advantages of using data test.
The experience of a designer going in and just saying, well, the test failed, so I'm just going to hide this and show my new component.
Yeah.
And then it breaks, and it's like, the test passed, what do you mean?
Yeah.
It's like everybody's scratching their head. And it's like, oh, yeah.
So we talked about refactoring. Oh, good, it didn't scroll down to my answers to YTDD. And let's, just because we are recording for folks to see in the future, let's throw that catch box around if you're willing to talk into it to share your results. It records because it's magic. Other reasons, benefits of going with a TDD approach. Got a little quiet when I asked you to use the catch box. There you go.
Give other people a chance, because I never shut up. I call this like eat your dinner before your dessert. It's the same thing with Storybook too, and it's the reason why I kind of advocate for Storybook-driven development. By writing the most boring part first, you're ensuring that you're going to actually do it, because if you're pressed for time and you write your components first, you're going to ditch the tests. And the same thing goes with documentation and like Storybook. So if you write that first, you still have to write the code. Like the code has to be finished. So you're ensuring that it's going to be tested by just doing that first. You're psychologically tricking yourself into doing it.
There you go. That's a good, nice.
Because it's addictive, like getting tests to pass, you write tests, write some code, and it's just, it really gives you a good metric on progress, right? Otherwise, sometimes you can feel like you wrote a lot of code, but what'd you really accomplish? And as you're hitting those tests, it feels good. So.
I remember I I've probably done the furthest extreme from test-driven development you can possibly do, which is when I was in high school, like doing my first web app, I like wrote the whole, I'd never heard of databases, and so I was like, oh, I just write things to a file. I know how to write things to a file. This is the 90s, and it's crazy days. And so I literally, it was as the opposite as you could be. I wrote all the code, never ran anything once, and I was like, okay, just like, oh, I found another edge case. I found another, thing. It's like time to add I didn't know the words abstraction even. Time to add an abstraction, time to add an object, and more methods and edge cases. And I was like, okay, time to start it up and see if it works. How well do you think that went? So, building one thing at a time and running it in the browser is a step in that direction. And so TDD, in a sense, is slicing it, and other approaches to do that first, slicing it finer and finer. Other thoughts, other benefits? Cypress folks, you guys probably have some I haven't thought of just because you're thinking about it a lot. Anything specific that comes to mind you want to share about?
I was just thinking, how do you know that, especially if you're working on a bug, like I had a bug today, how do you know that you even fixed the thing that you fixed without writing a failing test first? I was trying to fix a bug today very quickly and just like wrote the code like that definitely did it. And while I'm waiting for it to build and run all the tests and everything, I wrote a test to make sure that it worked the way that it did. And it definitely did not. So I had to rewrite the code. Another thing I can think is it's a great way to carve out what the data needs to look like for a view, especially we do a lot of we build the front end and the API at the same time. So like mocking all of the data on the front end. And if you're writing the test and getting that going first, it can kind of guide where the API needs to go and get you a minimal example of the data. So
Yeah.
there's just a couple things I could think of.
Great. Steph Scotland.
Yeah, that gets to your outside endpoint, right? If you write an implementation first, your API surface level is going to look completely different than if you write a test first. Test first, you're thinking, how do I want to call this? How do I want to use this? How do I want to work with this component? And that's my favorite way to name things, right? It's like, what would I love to have? Oh, that's the name of it.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And it prevents it from being driven by the implementation.
It's wish fulfillment design. You make a wish and then you make it come true. Any other thoughts? All right, let's see which ones I said. So confidence it works. It seems pretty straightforward. But it's like I have another talk I've done called How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Development. And it's all about agile practices and how they help get over worry. Getting to the point, I've worked for most of my career, just no tests at all. Unit tests, end tests, nothing. And just writing some code and pushing it out live, very waterfall approach. Every couple of months when we feel like we've crossed our fingers for long enough that we're going to push it out, and it's you just have no idea what's going to blow up. 100% test coverage. So I meant from a certain point of view. I gotta love the view puns. There's so many. I wrote a code review the other day, REVUEW, and it just made me so happy. It was just ridiculous. So 100% test coverage. So like I said, the end-to-end tests cover things 100%. You don't have to unit test every piece of the lower level, but you unit test the non-trivial behaviors. And so then, it's not every line, you don't necessarily have the kind of unit tests that really make it hard to refactor and make changes because they're coupled to the implementation, as Peter said. But they're coupled to the non-trivial aspects of it in a good way, in the way that's giving you confidence. Minimal code. So this relates to avoiding feature creep, to be able to write just enough to pass this test. And I have a meetup that I run where we do TDD exercises, and it drives folks crazy. We're like, I know how to implement this algorithm. Why are you making me only write enough to pass this tiny little test? And I still haven't figured out the best way to say it, but it's forcing you to write a test to cover the new behavior. So it's I already know how to build this. It's okay, great. We'll write enough tests to drive you to that, so that way you know that there's nothing in the behavior that could just break without you knowing. So it's going back and forth between two hats, the test writing hat and the implementation hat, and you kind of only focus on one at a time. Ability to refactor, we talked about that. and ultimately ability to ship quickly. So whether you're a business owner or whether you're a developer, either way, like we want to ship stuff quickly. Like we want to, build something cool, get it out there, help the customer or the business or the investors, the bottom line. And I think developers and business owners and the business side are more aligned in this than we usually think. Like developers are frustrated when we're moving slowly and things are risky and you never know when something's going to break. And the business is frustrated too. Like when things are, we want to be productive generally, unless you're the person that plays World of Warcraft, 7 hours out of 8 in the day. But I assume none of us are doing that. And so, things are aligned there. And then by having this test coverage, you can ship quickly. Like there's places that deploy to production, it's I don't know how to say it, fairly common. Like it's not a big unique thing for a company to have automatic deployment to production once you go to master and the test pass. Like it's a common thing. And so there's places where, dozens of times a day production deployments happen when you have this test. You do? That's awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, so that just not having the giant QA phase, not having the worry, and like you get into this downward cycle of, deployment is hard, let's not do it often, but that makes deployment harder. It just does not go anywhere good. It makes you happier, ultimately. So that's what I'm all about. Our desires as developers are aligned there. It makes development fun. Like the TDD it kicks those endorphins off, and it helps us to be productive and move forward. There is a mindset element to it, and so some folks may be more like this will automatically resonate with you. Other folks may be like, this seems ridiculous. It seems silly. So it's a muscle to train. And so if you haven't tried this approach, I'd encourage you to try it out. Try it with Cypress because it works really well, and get a feel for it and see and discipline yourself to try to take those small steps. I don't take them all the time when I'm coding, but because I've learned to take the tiny steps, I can get a feel for I'll try to take a medium-sized step. Oh, things blew up. Let me back up. Let me take a smaller step because this, I'm new on this Vue project. This is new. I'm not totally sure how this is working. My test errors are not giving me good feedback. Let me take a smaller step so I know exactly what went wrong. And instead of spending a ton of time debugging, I spend a little time looking at the one change I made that caused the test to fail and figuring out why. One thing I'd say, just thinking about all of us professionally, test-driven development is very common in the Rails world that I come from. It's a mixed bag on the back end in other languages, and it's not all that common on the front end. I think the lack of built-in support has been part of it, and so Vue has a big advantage there. And the tooling like Cypress, like other tools, like for React Native, there's a tool called Detox that's really, really powerful. So tooling is coming around and it's really great, and you have the opportunity to just level up in testing, level up in test-driven development, and have it be one of your distinctives personally, or as a company, like that you have a test-driven development approach and you're able to ship faster and more reliably than your competitors. So, the road is wide open on the front end for developers to learn this. There's low-hanging fruit, and so I'd really encourage you to give it a try. As I said, that this is I can take a little credit for it. This is a website I made because I'm obsessed with TDD, and I work in a lot of different frameworks. So there's other frameworks on the website too. But check it out to learn TDD in Vue. Here's the books I mentioned. I mentioned one and didn't mention the other. So Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests is the book that this approach to testing comes from. It's not even server-side Java. It's like running on the client, Java application on your computer Java. So that's exciting. So it's a little old. Maybe you haven't done Java before. I haven't done Java in a while, but the principles all apply exactly the same. And in fact, the fact that it's not a server-rendered app, some of the principles in it apply a little bit more directly to our rich client-side applications in JavaScript as well. This is Ed Yerberg's book, Testing Vue.js Applications. It's in the MEEP, which makes you think of a Muppet, but it's Manning Early Access Program. So it's partially complete. It's got 8 chapters. Really great. So check out his talk. I should post the URL to his video up on the meetup. I'll post the book as well. If you like his talk at the Vue Amsterdam, you'll love the book. So I highly recommend it. I don't know that he gets into any end-to-end testing, but his approach to component testing the contract totally lines up with what we've been talking about here. So it's a really, really great read.